Marcus wiped grease from his calloused hands, never knowing that the woman laughing at his workbench would become his wife, never knowing that her casual jest about marriage would transform from mockery into the most sincere promise of her life. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Marcus Rodriguez knelt beside the rusted Honda Civic, his weathered hands moving with the precision of a surgeon as he diagnosed the engine's ailment. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead in the cramped garage, casting dancing shadows across oil-stained concrete floors that had seen better decades. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the thin metal walls of Rodriguez Auto Repair, a shop that had been his father's dream and had become his burden. The smell of motor oil and old coffee permeated the air, mingling with the faint scent of his mother's lavender soap that still clung to his work shirt from their morning embrace. Marcus had risen before dawn, as he did every day, to prepare breakfast for Maria Rodriguez before her dialysis appointment, his calloused fingers gentle as they helped her into her wheelchair. At 28, he possessed an almost supernatural ability to hear what engines whispered, to feel their pain through the vibrations that traveled up his arms. But this gift felt more like a curse when paired with the mounting medical bills that arrived like clockwork every month. His mother's kidney disease had progressed rapidly over the past year, and the treatments that kept her alive were slowly killing their financial stability. The shop barely broke even on good months, and lately, good months were as rare as honest politicians. Marcus worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat: days at the shop, evenings at the loading dock across town, and weekends doing house calls for elderly customers who trusted his honesty over the flashy chain stores downtown. His hands were permanently stained with grease, his back ached from bending over engines, and his eyes burned from squinting at intricate mechanical puzzles in dim light. Yet when he worked, when his fingers danced across pistons and cylinders, when he coaxed life back into dying machines, Marcus felt something approaching peace. He understood engines better than he understood people, found their logical problems more manageable than the chaos of human emotion. The Honda's owner, Mrs. Chikas Chen from the corner market, had tears in her eyes when she dropped it off because 3 other mechanics had declared it beyond salvation. But Marcus heard something different in the engine's labored breathing, saw potential where others saw scrap metal. As he worked, his mind calculated not just the cost of parts, but the cost of everything else: rent, utilities, groceries, medicine, hope. Victoria Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her 42nd floor office, gazing down at the city that sprawled beneath her like a circuit board of ambition and dreams. The skyline of Manhattan glittered in the afternoon sun, each building a testament to someone's vision. But from this height, people looked like ants scurrying through predetermined paths. At 32, she commanded Sterling Industries, a tech empire worth $3 billion that her parents had built from nothing, transforming a small software company into a global powerhouse that employed thousands and shaped the digital landscape. The weight of their legacy pressed against her shoulders like an expensive coat that never quite fit properly. Her corner office, decorated by an interior designer who charged more per consultation than most people earned in a year, felt more like a beautiful prison than a sanctuary. The mahogany desk imported Italian leather chairs, and abstract art that critics called revolutionary meant nothing when she ate dinner alone every night, staring at her reflection in the dining room table that seated 12 but never hosted more than 1. 5 years had passed since the car accident that stole her parents from her on a rainy Thursday evening, their limousine sliding off a mountain road during what was supposed to be a celebratory weekend trip. Victoria had inherited everything: the company, the fortune, the responsibilities, and the crushing loneliness that came with being perpetually surrounded by people who wanted something from her. Board meetings filled her days with voices that spoke in careful, measured tones, their words calculated to please rather than inform. Every relationship felt transactional, every friendship suspect, every romantic encounter tainted by the knowledge that men saw her net worth before they saw her heart. She had learned to read the signs, the way conversations shifted when someone discovered her identity, The subtle changes in body language when people realized they were talking to Victoria Sterling rather than just Victoria. Her personal assistant screened her calls, her security team monitored her movements, and her lawyer vetted her social interactions, creating layers of protection that also served as barriers to genuine connection. The mansion in the Hamptons echoed with emptiness despite its 8 bedrooms and staff of 12. The swimming pool reflected only sky and clouds, and the garage filled with luxury cars. She rarely drove, sat like expensive monuments to her isolation. Victoria craved authenticity in a world that offered her only performance, yearned for someone who would argue with her rather than agree, someone who would see past the fortune to the woman who still missed her parents' Sunday phone calls and who sometimes cried in boardroom bathrooms after particularly brutal meetings. Victoria pressed the accelerator of her father's 1973 Porsche 911 Carrera, feeling the familiar rumble that had comforted her through countless sleepless nights when the weight of Sterling Industries felt too heavy to bear alone. She had escaped the suffocating atmosphere of another board meeting where executives spoke in corporate euphemisms and avoided her eyes, their deference as cold as their ambition was transparent. The vintage sports car was her sanctuary, the one possession that connected her to happier memories of weekend drives with her father, his weathered hands guiding hers on the steering wheel as he taught her that cars, unlike people, responded honestly to your touch. Today she wore faded jeans and an old Columbia sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, the uniform of anonymity that allowed her to disappear into the world beyond her glass tower. The city blurred past her windows as she drove aimlessly through neighborhoods she had never explored, seeking the kind of authentic experience that money could not manufacture and assistance could not schedule. But as she navigated through a working-class district where chain-link fences bordered modest homes and corner bodegas advertised lottery tickets in multiple languages, the engine began to cough and sputter like an old man struggling for breath. The familiar purr transformed into an ominous grinding sound that made her heart race with panic, not for her safety, but for the car that represented her last tangible connection to her father's memory. Steam began rising from beneath the hood as the Porsche shuddered to a halt outside a weathered auto repair shop with hand-painted signs advertising honest work at fair prices. Victoria sat in the sudden silence, her hands trembling on the steering wheel as she realized she was completely alone in an unfamiliar neighborhood without her security detail, without her driver, without the protective bubble that usually surrounded her every movement. The shop's garage door was open, revealing a cluttered workspace where tools hung on pegboards and an old radio played classic rock. The smell of motor oil and determination drifted toward her through the autumn air, reminding her of her father's own garage, where he had tinkered with engines long after Sterling Industries had made such hobbies unnecessary luxuries. With no other choice and her phone showing no signal, Victoria stepped out of the disabled Porsche and walked toward the shop, her designer sneakers crunching on gravel as she approached what looked like her only hope for salvation, unaware that she was about to meet the man who would change everything about her carefully controlled existence. Marcus emerged from beneath the Honda Civic at the sound of expensive footsteps on gravel, wiping his hands on a shop rag as he looked up to see a woman standing in his doorway like she had stepped out of a different world entirely. Even dressed casually, everything about her spoke of money. The way she held herself with unconscious authority, the subtle perfection of her appearance that only came from a lifetime of privilege, the kind of understated confidence that Marcus had only seen in magazines. Victoria Sterling, though he did not yet know her name, stood beside a vintage Porsche that was clearly worth more than his shop and probably his entire block. Her arms crossed defensively as steam continued to rise from the engine like incense from a very expensive altar. "I need help," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, though Marcus detected an edge of vulnerability beneath the command. "My car just died, and I have no idea where I am." Marcus approached the Porsche with the reverence he reserved for truly exceptional machines, his trained eye taking in the classic lines and meticulous restoration work that had kept this 40-year-old beauty running. "She's gorgeous," he murmured, running his fingers along the hood with the gentle touch of someone who understood that cars were more than transportation. They were dreams made manifest in metal and chrome. Victoria watched him with growing skepticism as he popped the hood and began his examination, her frustration mounting with each passing moment. 3 mechanics at luxury dealerships told me the engine has a fundamental flaw that can't be fixed without completely rebuilding it, she said, her tone sharpening with remembered annoyance. They wanted to charge me $50,000 and said it would take 6 months. Marcus continued his methodical inspection, his ears attuned to sounds that others might miss, his fingers probing connections and components with the delicacy of a master craftsman. Well, Victoria continued, her voice taking on a mocking edge born of disappointment and desperation, if you can actually fix what those experts couldn't, I'll marry you. She laughed, but it was a brittle sound that spoke of too many broken promises and shattered expectations. That's how impossible this problem is supposed to be. Marcus looked up from the engine compartment, meeting her gaze for the first time with eyes that held neither judgment nor awe at her obvious wealth, only the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his life solving problems that others deemed unsolvable. "Give me tonight," he said simply, his voice steady as bedrock. "I'll take a look." Marcus slid his mechanic's light beneath the Porsche's hood, the beam illuminating an engine bay that told stories beyond mere mechanical function. Every component had been lovingly maintained, each bolt and wire showing the careful attention of someone who understood that this machine represented more than transportation. As his fingers traced the fuel lines and examined the intricate fuel injection system, he noticed details that spoke of deep personal connection. A small engraved plate near the battery that read, "Happy birthday, Robert, love always, Margaret 1973. And oil stains on the garage floor that had been cleaned with the devotion of ritual rather than mere maintenance. "This was your father's car," Marcus said quietly, not looking up from his work, but feeling the sudden stillness that settled over Victoria like a heavy blanket. She had been pacing behind him, her expensive sneakers tapping an anxious rhythm on his concrete floor, but now she stood frozen, as if his words had turned her to stone. "How did you know that?" she whispered, her voice stripped of its earlier authority and reduced to something raw and vulnerable. Marcus straightened slowly, his grease-stained fingers still holding his diagnostic light as he turned to face her properly for the first time. "The way you look at her," he said, his words gentle as morning rain. "Same way I look at my mother when she's sleeping in her hospital bed. Like you're afraid if you blink too long, she might disappear forever." Victoria's composure cracked like ice under pressure, her carefully constructed walls crumbling as tears began to gather in her eyes. "He taught me to drive in this car," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the distant hum of traffic outside. "Every Sunday morning, we would take it out to the country roads, just the two of us. He said cars were honest. They either run or they don't. No politics, no lies, no hidden agendas." Marcus nodded with the understanding of someone who had learned life's most important lessons in similar circumstances, his respect for the machine deepening as he comprehended its true significance. "She's been trying to tell you something," he said, running his palm along the Porsche's fender with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. "These old engines, they speak if you know how to listen. Sometimes they break down, not because they can't run, but because they need attention, need to be heard." He moved around the car with deliberate care, his examination becoming less clinical and more ceremonial, treating each component as a keeper of memories rather than merely a mechanical part that might fail or function. The autumn night settled over the garage like a familiar blanket as Marcus cleared his workbench and began the methodical process of diagnosis that had become second nature over years of coaxing life back into dying machines. Victoria had initially planned to call a taxi and return in the morning, her discomfort with the unfamiliar neighborhood evident in the way she clutched her phone and glanced toward the street every few minutes. But something about Marcus's reverent approach to her father's Porsche held her attention like gravity. The way he spoke to the engine in soft murmurs, and touched each component as if he were reading Braille written in metal and oil. "You don't have to stay," he told her as he rolled his creeper beneath the chassis, his voice echoing slightly from underneath the car. "This could take hours, and it's not exactly comfortable here." But Victoria found herself settling onto an overturned crate, drawn by a fascination she could not name as she watched this stranger work with a devotion that bordered on spiritual. The garage filled with the sounds of careful labor, the clink of tools against metal, the whisper of moving parts being cleaned and examined, the occasional satisfied grunt when Marcus discovered something significant. He worked with the patience of a monk illuminating manuscripts, never rushing, never forcing connections that did not want to be made. His hands moved with surgical precision as he traced fuel lines and tested electrical connections, occasionally pausing to explain what he was finding in terms that transformed mechanical jargon into poetry about pressure and flow and the delicate balance that made combustion possible. "The fuel distributor is starving cylinders 5 and 6, he murmured, more to himself than to her, his diagnostic light casting dancing shadows on the garage walls. "She's been compensating for months, trying to keep running on 4 cylinders when she needs all 6 to sing properly." Victoria watched him work until midnight, then until 1, then 2, mesmerized by his complete absorption in the task and the way he seemed to commune with her father's car as if they shared a secret language. Coffee grew cold in paper cups as Marcus lost himself in the rhythm of discovery and repair, his world narrowing to the space beneath the hood where mysteries waited to be solved through patience and skill rather than money and influence. When he finally emerged near dawn, grease-stained and exhausted, but wearing the quiet satisfaction of someone who had solved an impossible puzzle, Victoria realized she had witnessed something rare in her world of corporate meetings and calculated exchanges, pure dedication driven not by profit, but by genuine care for the work itself. As the night deepened and Marcus's work continued with methodical precision, conversation began to flow between them in the natural way that darkness encourages honesty, their words weaving around the sounds of careful, mechanical investigation like background music to an unfolding symphony. Victoria found herself sharing fragments of her life that she had never voiced to anyone. How board meetings felt like theatrical performances where everyone played roles they had memorized. How success felt hollow when there was no one to celebrate with who truly understood the cost of achievement. "My father used to say that engines teach you patience," Marcus said, his voice muffled as he worked beneath the dashboard, tracing electrical connections with the dedication of an archaeologist uncovering ancient treasures. "They don't care how much money you have or how important you think you are. They only respond to understanding and respect." I watched him emerge from beneath the dash, wiping his hands on the shop rag that had become as much a part of his uniform as the faded jeans and work shirt that bore the honest stains of labor. "You talk about your mother a lot," she observed, noting how his expression softened whenever he mentioned the woman who was clearly the center of his universe, despite her illness, or perhaps because of it. Marcus paused in his work, his eyes taking on the distant look of someone remembering moments too precious to disturb with casual words. "She raised me alone after my father died, when I was 12, he said, his voice carrying the weight of gratitude mixed with current worry. "Worked 2 jobs to keep me in school, never complained, never made me feel like a burden even when I probably was. Now it's my turn to take care of her, and some days I feel like I'm failing." The vulnerability in his admission surprised Victoria, accustomed as she was to conversations where people presented only their strengths and achievements, their carefully curated versions of success that revealed nothing of their struggles or fears. "She's lucky to have you," Victoria said, meaning it in a way that surprised her with its sincerity. Most people would have given up, found excuses, moved on to easier problems. Marcus looked at her then with eyes that seemed to see through the designer clothes and expensive accessories to something deeper, something she had almost forgotten existed beneath the layers of corporate armor she wore daily. "Easy problems aren't worth solving," he replied simply, returning to his work with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that character was built in moments when no one was watching. when the right choice was also the harder choice, when love demanded sacrifice without promise of reward. The first pale light of dawn crept through the garage windows as Marcus made his final adjustments to the fuel injection system, his movements precise despite the exhaustion that weighed on his shoulders like lead blankets. He had traced the problem through a labyrinth of mechanical possibilities, discovering what 3 luxury dealership mechanics had missed: a microscopic crack in the fuel distributor housing that created an intermittent vacuum leak so subtle that it only manifested under specific temperature and pressure conditions. The flaw was invisible to cursory inspection, but revealed itself to Marcus through hours of patient listening, feeling, and intuitive understanding of how the engine's various systems communicated with each other through vibrations and sounds that others dismissed as background noise. Victoria had dozed fitfully on her makeshift seat, jerking awake periodically to find Marcus still working with the same methodical dedication he had shown at midnight, his concentration never wavering despite the cold and fatigue that would have defeated lesser mechanics. Now, as he tightened the final connection and cleaned his tools with the ritual precision of a surgeon completing a delicate operation, she watched him prepare for the moment of truth with an anticipation that surprised her with its intensity. "Cross your fingers," Marcus said quietly, sliding behind the wheel of the Porsche with the reverent care of someone handling a sacred artifact. He turned the key and the engine caught immediately, not with the labored coughing that had plagued it for months, but with the smooth, powerful purr that had been her father's pride and joy decades earlier. The sound filled the garage like music, each cylinder firing in perfect harmony, the mechanical symphony that luxury dealership experts had declared impossible to restore, now playing with crystalline clarity. Marcus sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as he listened to the engine's contented hum, his expression showing not triumph, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who had honored both the machine and the memories it carried. Victoria approached the car slowly, her eyes wide with disbelief that gradually transformed into something approaching awe, as she realized that this man, working alone in his humble shop with basic tools and infinite patience, had achieved what teams of certified specialists with computer diagnostics and unlimited budgets had deemed impossible. "How?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the perfect sound of the restored engine. Marcus stepped out of the car and handed her the keys with the same gentle respect he had shown the machine itself. "Sometimes the smallest problems make the biggest noise," he said simply, his grease-stained fingers brushing hers as she accepted the keys that represented far more than transportation. They were her connection to her father, restored through the dedication of a stranger who had asked for nothing but the opportunity to make something broken whole again. Victoria returned to her glass tower in Manhattan, the familiar luxury of her executive suite feeling somehow hollow after spending the night in Marcus's cluttered garage where authenticity lived in every oil-stained corner and genuine care spoke louder than quarterly profit reports. She found herself distracted during board meetings, her mind wandering from discussions of market expansion and revenue projections to memories of calloused hands working with reverent precision on her father's engine, the way Marcus had spoken to the Porsche as if it were a living thing deserving of respect and understanding. The city that had once energized her now felt like an elaborate stage set populated by actors delivering rehearsed lines, their conversations about success and achievement ringing hollow compared to Marcus's simple declaration that fair was fair and fair was all he needed. Unable to concentrate on the contracts and reports that demanded her attention, Victoria found herself conducting a different kind of research, using resources that her wealth and position made available to investigate the life of the man who had restored more than just her car. Through carefully placed inquiries and discreet investigations, she learned that Marcus Rodriguez was known throughout his neighborhood as the mechanic who never overcharged elderly customers, who often accepted payment in installments or bartered services for homemade meals when money was tight, who had been seen pushing disabled cars off busy streets in the rain without being asked and without expecting compensation. Mrs. Chen from the corner market spoke of him with tears in her eyes, explaining how he had kept her delivery truck running for 3 years past its expected lifespan, accepting groceries instead of cash when her business struggled through the pandemic. The pastor at St. Anthony's Church mentioned Marcus's quiet donations of labor, how he maintained the church van that transported elderly parishioners to medical appointments, never seeking recognition or praise for work that kept their small community connected and mobile. Victoria discovered that Maria Rodriguez's medical bills had forced Marcus to take out loans against his shop, that he worked 18-hour days to keep his mother in treatment while maintaining the business that employed 2 other mechanics who depended on their jobs to support their own families. The financial records that her investigators compiled painted a picture of a man who chose integrity over profit at every turn, who measured success not in accumulated wealth, but in problems solved and people helped, whose definition of prosperity centered on his ability to care for those he loved rather than the expansion of his personal empire. Victoria sat in her corner office overlooking the city skyline, her laptop displaying financial reports that held no interest for her as she orchestrated a campaign of anonymous assistance that would change Marcus's life without revealing her involvement in his sudden change of fortune. She established shell companies and charitable foundations with names that sounded official but untraceable, funneling money through layers of legal complexity that her attorneys arranged without question, their expertise in corporate anonymity serving a purpose more noble than tax avoidance or hostile takeovers. Within a week of her return from his garage, Marcus began receiving customers who claimed they had heard about his expertise through word-of-mouth recommendations that seemed impossibly widespread for a small neighborhood shop, luxury car owners who traveled across the city seeking his services, corporate fleet managers who brought their vehicles to him despite having contracts with larger operations, mysterious referrals that arrived with clockwork precision and premium repair budgets. The bills for Maria Rodriguez's dialysis treatments were suddenly covered by a medical charity that had never existed before Victoria created it, the payments arriving with official letterhead and legitimate documentation that made them impossible to refuse or trace back to their actual source. Victoria used her extensive network of contacts to generate business for Rodriguez Auto Repair, recommending Marcus to executives who mentioned car trouble, arranging for Sterling Industries company vehicles to be serviced at his shop, and even hiring actors to pose as satisfied customers who left glowing online reviews that boosted his reputation throughout the metropolitan area. She monitored his progress from afar through carefully placed informants who reported that Marcus worked with the same dedication and integrity despite his improved circumstances, that he continued to charge fair prices and treat every customer with equal respect regardless of whether they drove luxury sedans or aging economy cars. Marcus began to notice the changes in his business with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment, unable to understand why his phone suddenly rang constantly with new customers who somehow knew exactly what services he provided and seemed willing to pay premium prices for his honest work. His mother's medical bills stopped arriving in their familiar, threatening envelopes, replaced by letters from insurance companies and charitable organizations explaining that her treatments were fully covered through programs he had never heard of but was afraid to question. The financial pressure that had kept him working multiple jobs began to ease as Rodriguez Auto Repair thrived beyond his wildest dreams. Yet Marcus remained haunted by the feeling that these blessings were somehow connected to the mysterious woman who had challenged him to fix an impossible engine and then disappeared back into whatever world had produced such casual wealth and unconscious authority. The phone call came at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday when autumn was surrendering to winter's first bitter embrace. Maria Rodriguez's voice weak and frightened as she explained that something was terribly wrong, that the dialysis treatments that had been sustaining her were no longer enough to keep her kidneys functioning at even minimal capacity. Marcus raced through empty streets to the hospital where his mother lay connected to machines that beeped with electronic urgency, her skin gray with the toxins that her body could no longer filter, her eyes holding the kind of fear that came from understanding that medical miracles had limits and insurance coverage had boundaries that even mysterious charitable organizations could not cross. The kidney specialist, a tired-looking woman who had delivered similar news too many times to count, explained that Maria needed a transplant within weeks rather than months. that her condition had deteriorated beyond what outpatient treatments could manage, that the waiting list for donor organs stretched for years, while Maria's time could be measured in days if they could not find a compatible living donor willing to undergo surgery. Marcus sat beside his mother's hospital bed holding her hand while machines breathed for her and pumped her blood through filters that performed the work her kidneys could no longer accomplish. His mind racing through impossible calculations of time and money and medical procedures that existed beyond his understanding but within his desperate need. The doctors spoke of experimental treatments available at specialized medical centers, of surgical procedures that could extend her life, but required resources that exceeded even the mysterious financial assistance that had been covering her basic care, of hope that came with price tags measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars rather than the modest sums his improved business could generate. Victoria learned of the crisis within hours through the network of informants and medical contacts she had established to monitor Marcus's situation, her phone buzzing with urgent messages from private investigators and hospital administrators who reported that Maria Rodriguez's condition had become critical, that the family faced decisions no family should have to make about the value of life measured against financial impossibility. She sat in her empty penthouse apartment overlooking the city where Marcus was keeping vigil beside his dying mother, her vast wealth suddenly feeling like a burden rather than a privilege. As she realized that all her anonymous assistance had been inadequate preparation for this moment, when subtlety and secrecy would be insufficient to save the woman who represented everything Marcus valued in the world, when her carefully constructed distance between their lives would force her to choose between maintaining her anonymity and preventing the loss that would destroy the man who had restored her father's car and, without knowing it, had begun to restore her faith in human goodness. Victoria entered the hospital waiting room at dawn after a sleepless night of wrestling with her conscience and coordinating with medical specialists across 3 states. Her designer clothes replaced by simple jeans and a sweater that made her look less like a corporate titan and more like the vulnerable woman she had forgotten she could be. Marcus sat hunched in a plastic chair beside the window where gray morning light filtered through Venetian blinds, his work clothes wrinkled from sleeping in hospital corridors, his eyes red with exhaustion and grief as he kept vigil for the mother who had raised him, to be the man who would never accept charity, but would die trying to earn what could not be earned. "Marcus," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the antiseptic silence that filled spaces where hope and despair waged their eternal battle. He looked up with a slow recognition of someone emerging from deep contemplation about mortality and miracles, his confusion evident as he processed the presence of the woman whose car he had fixed months earlier, whose casual jest about marriage had become the catalyst for changes he could not understand. "I'm Victoria Sterling," she continued, the name carrying weight that even Marcus's exhaustion could not ignore, the syllables heavy with implications of power and wealth that explained everything and nothing about why she stood before him in his darkest hour. "I'm the one who's been paying your mother's bills, sending customers to your shop, trying to help without you knowing it was me." The admission hung between them like smoke, visible and toxic, as Marcus rose slowly from his chair with the careful movements of a man whose world had just shifted on its axis in ways that made hospital floors feel unstable beneath his feet. "You're telling me that everything good that's happened to my business, all the customers, all the help with my mother's treatments, that was you." His voice rose with each word, anger and bewilderment mixing into something approaching fury as he realized that months of gratitude had been misdirected, that his pride had been trampled by kindness he had never requested and could never repay. "I don't need your charity," he said, his hands clenching into fists as years of struggle and dignity warred with the reality that accepting help might be the only way to save his mother. "I don't need you swooping down from your ivory tower to fix problems you think I'm too poor or too stupid to handle myself." Victoria felt tears burning behind her eyes as she watched this good man reject the assistance that could save everything he cared about, her heart breaking for the pride that would not bend, even when bending might mean survival. It wasn't charity, she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of admissions she had never expected to make. It was love, Marcus, even though I didn't understand it myself until right now, watching you hate me for caring about you the only way I knew how. Marcus turned away from Victoria's tear-streaked face and walked to the window where the city sprawled beyond the hospital grounds, his reflection ghost-like in the glass as he struggled to process the revelation that his recent good fortune had been orchestrated by a woman whose wealth could probably buy the entire hospital where his mother lay dying. "You don't understand," he said, his voice hollow with the exhaustion of someone who had fought for everything he possessed only to discover that his victories had been subsidized by pity from someone who lived in a world where problems were solved with checkbooks rather than calloused hands and sleepless nights. "This is exactly what I was afraid of when I realized who you were that first night, when I saw the way you looked at my shop like it was some quaint tourist attraction, some authentic experience you could buy and then forget about when you got bored." Victoria stepped closer, desperate to bridge the chasm that was opening between them with each word, her hand reaching toward his shoulder only to fall back as she recognized that her touch would feel like another attempt to purchase what could not be bought. "That's not what this was," she insisted, her voice breaking with the frustration of someone whose good intentions had been interpreted as condescension, whose love had been mistaken for charity. "I helped because I care about you, because watching you work on my father's car showed me what real integrity looks like, what it means to love something enough to sacrifice for it without expecting anything in return." Marcus laughed bitterly, the sound echoing off hospital walls that had witnessed countless family tragedies and medical miracles, his shoulders shaking with the weight of disappointment that cut deeper than his mother's illness, because it touched the part of him that had dared to believe that someone might value him for who he was rather than what he needed. "You care about me the way rich people care about endangered animals," he said, his words sharp as broken glass. "From a safe distance, with money and good intentions, but never getting close enough to understand that we don't want to be your noble cause or your redemption project." The accusation hit Victoria like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the possibility that her privileged perspective had blinded her to the dignity she had inadvertently trampled in her effort to help, that her love had become another form of inequality between them. "Marcus, please," she whispered. But he was already walking away, his footsteps echoing down the hospital corridor toward his mother's room, where real problems required real solutions that money alone could never provide, leaving Victoria standing alone in the waiting room where she realized she had lost the only genuine connection she had found in years of searching for something authentic in a world made artificial by her wealth. Marcus sat in his mother's hospital room through the long hours of the night, watching her sleep while machines monitored her failing kidneys with electronic vigilance, his mind replaying conversations with Victoria that had seemed casual at the time but now revealed depths he had been too proud or too afraid to acknowledge. He remembered how she had spoken about her father with the same reverence he felt for his mother, how her laughter in his garage had sounded different from the brittle performance he now realized she probably gave in boardrooms, how she had stayed awake all night watching him work, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had found something in his humble shop that her wealth could not provide: authenticity, purpose, the simple pleasure of watching someone care deeply about their craft. The woman who had challenged him to fix her impossible engine had not been slumming or seeking entertainment. She had been searching for connection with someone who would see her as more than a bank account with legs, someone who would value her presence rather than her presence. Marcus realized with growing shame that Victoria had shown him her true self that night, vulnerable, lonely, desperate for genuine human contact, and he had repaid her honesty with suspicion and wounded pride. Meanwhile, Victoria wandered through her Hamptons mansion like a ghost haunting her own life, the marble floors echoing with footsteps that emphasized the emptiness of rooms designed for entertaining crowds, but inhabited only by a woman who had forgotten how to be happy. Her reflection in the dining room's mahogany table stared back accusingly as she ate another solitary meal, the silence broken only by the ticking of antique clocks that measured time she was wasting in self-imposed isolation. The quarterly reports scattered across her home office desk showed Sterling Industries thriving under her leadership. Stock prices climbing, market share expanding, profit margins that would make her parents proud. Yet none of these achievements provided the satisfaction that she had felt watching Marcus restore her father's car with nothing but skill and dedication. She had spent years building walls to protect herself from people who wanted her money. But now she understood that those same walls had prevented her from recognizing someone who had wanted nothing from her except the chance to help. Someone who had seen her not as Victoria Sterling, the billionaire, but as the woman who missed her father and needed her most precious possession repaired by hands that understood the difference between mechanical restoration and emotional healing. Marcus stood outside the hospital's financial aid office holding papers that confirmed what the doctors had explained with clinical compassion. His mother needed immediate surgery that would cost more money than he could earn in 5 lifetimes, and pride was a luxury he could no longer afford when measured against the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him. His hands trembled as he dialed Victoria's number, the phone feeling heavier than any tool he had ever wielded, his voice barely a whisper when she answered with desperate hope evident in her simple hello. "I need your help," he said, each word cutting his throat like swallowed glass. His admission of defeat transformed into an act of love for the mother, whose labored breathing had become a countdown to decisions no son should have to make. "Not for me, for her, because she doesn't deserve to pay for my stubborn pride with her life." Victoria was in her car within minutes, racing through traffic with the focused intensity she usually reserved for hostile takeovers, her phone coordinating medical specialists and surgical teams, while her heart hammered with relief that Marcus had trusted her enough to bridge the chasm his wounded dignity had created between them. She arrived at the hospital carrying more than just financial resources. She brought connections to the country's finest nephrologists, relationships with medical research centers conducting experimental treatments, and the kind of influence that could move organ donor lists and schedule emergency surgeries that normally required weeks of preparation. Together they navigated the labyrinthine bureaucracy of modern healthcare. Victoria's wealth opening doors that would have remained locked to Marcus's determination alone, while his intimate knowledge of his mother's condition and medical history provided the human context that administrative systems could never capture. Marcus watched Victoria work with the same focused precision he brought to mechanical problems, her phone calls cutting through red tape and insurance restrictions, her checkbook eliminating financial barriers, while her genuine concern for his mother's well-being proved that her involvement was motivated by love rather than guilt or pity. They spent 72 hours in hospital conference rooms and surgical waiting areas, their earlier argument forgotten in the face of shared purpose, their different worlds united by the understanding that some things, life, family, love, transcended economic boundaries and social divisions. When the transplant coordinator finally announced that a compatible donor had been found and surgery could proceed within hours, Marcus and Victoria stood together in the hospital corridor where fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on tile floors, their hands finding each other with the natural gravity of two people who had learned that connection was more valuable than pride, that accepting help was sometimes the bravest thing a person could do. The weeks following Maria Rodriguez's successful kidney transplant passed in a gentle rhythm of recovery and reconstruction, both medical and emotional. As Marcus divided his time between his mother's bedside and quiet conversations with Victoria that gradually rebuilt the trust his pride had temporarily shattered. Maria emerged from surgery with renewed strength and clarity, her color returning as her new kidney began the miraculous work of filtering toxins that had been slowly poisoning her system for years, her eyes bright with gratitude for the second chance that medical skill and financial resources had made possible. Victoria visited the hospital daily, bringing flowers that brightened Maria's room and conversations that revealed her genuine affection for the woman who had raised the man who had unknowingly changed her life, their relationship developing naturally without the burden of obligation or the awkwardness of charity between strangers. Marcus found himself looking forward to Victoria's visits, not because she continued to coordinate his mother's care with military precision, but because she listened to Maria's stories about his childhood with the same unread attentiveness she had shown his mechanical work, laughing at tales of his stubborn independence, and weeping openly when Maria described the pride she felt watching her son build his business through honest labor and ethical practice. They discovered common ground in unexpected places, as a Gigi both had lost parents too early and carried the weight of inherited expectations. Both understood the loneliness that came from being defined by their circumstances rather than their character. Both valued the rare authenticity that existed when people chose to help others without seeking recognition or reward. Victoria began spending time at Rodriguez Auto Repair, not as the wealthy patron who had funded its success but as someone learning to appreciate the satisfaction of work that produced tangible results.